Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Science of Sports Spotlight. We are today casting our spotlight on a few different stories, starting with a little bit of rugby, somewhat selfishly, because it's what I've been immersed in for the last week in London and this week in Rome, as you can see from the nondescript hotel room in the background. We then got some discussions. Something came up in the Winter Olympics we wanted to chat about. We've got some doping stories from two different sports, some debate around women's world records, and then we'll end with an end finally. And joining me to discuss this, as always, is our figure skating and curling correspondent from Wales, Gareth Davies.
Thanks very much. Anything that scored subjectively is not my friend. How did it go, actually, your conferences? Is there anything you can tell us from World Rugby, or are you sworn to secrecy in these sort of things?
No, it's fine. Like, I'm happy to be transparent about these things. In case people didn't know, every year in February, World Rugby holds what's become called the Shape of the Game Conference, and it started out as a considerably smaller meeting than it is now. It now had comfortably in excess of 100 people from different roles around the world in sport, in the game, from coaches all the way to CEOs and executives, board members, and so on. And they discuss the shape of the game, literally, where it's at, law change, commercial factors, competition, calendar, all the sort of stuff you see debated in the news. There was a there was a press release that came out afterwards. I don't know whether you saw that. Um, Basically, they said, and I thought of you at the time, well, not just then, but throughout, because there's this tension in the sport about whether to change things or to stabilize, let them be for a while, and there are two schools of thought. One is let's just give it full 4 years and not make any adjustments to the laws, let people play and see how it goes. And then the other school of thought says you have to constantly be evolving, trying to keep up with what people are doing to exploit and maximize the laws. Because I think, I mean, we said before, like one of the best things about rugby is that it is so complex and there are many different ways to try and win. You can find advantages in so many different contests because the sport's just a series of contests. There's a kickoff, there's a line out, there's a scrum, there's a maul, there's a tackle that leads to a ruck or breakdown. And every single one of those is a contest that has to be balanced so that there's this, call it equity in the contest. And when a clever coach comes along to try and exploit a loophole or an opening, then you got to plug it, or do you? And that was really the substance of a lot of the discussion that goes on there.
Hmm. I mean, I had a bit of a rant in my own discourse. That's probably what you're referring to, that I'm fed up of them tinkering with the laws and just leave it be. Because it's a bit like analogous to if you get an injury in sports, there are people who just fiddle with it and want to just like fix it all the time and everything, and it never ends well. Just leave things alone and let them evolve naturally. And feel that rugby's been just poking and prodding, and the fans are getting a little bit fed up of it. The product's okay, and I think sport, and it's not just rugby. I think all sports need to have a little bit more confidence in the product that they have, and not keep trying to chase these changes.
Yeah, so that's certainly one of the schools of thought and one of the sides that was being discussed at that meeting. The counterpoint to that is, I guess, two elements. One is when someone comes along and finds a gap or an opportunity in the laws, then does it create player welfare consequences? There've been some like that, and I think you can pretty comfortably handle those. Like a couple of years ago, they discovered that in the setup of a scrum, the forwards were basically preloading their spines. They were putting their heads on the head of the opposing player, and then when they called the set move, they were slipping off that bind. And that's obviously quite dangerous because you massively increase that sudden force that gets applied to the neck. So, and the chronic force in the set position, right? Or the crouch bind set, yeah, bind position. So then you just make clarifications. But the other thing that I find interesting is that there are a lot of people who are saying that the sport is dying and that it's not attracting the necessary fans and realizing its quote unquote value. And by that we mean commercial. And so then people start saying, well, where can we make the game more attractive? And this is where like things get maybe a little bit more tense because for one group of people, making it more attractive means they don't want to see scrums, they don't want to see set phases. It's what we discussed with John Dobson when we interviewed him on this podcast.
Hmm.
So they say that's boring rugby. And they had this market research which was presented a couple of years ago at that Shape of the Game meeting, where they'd made people watch the sport wearing these devices that measure blood flow to the palm. Now, I'm the scientist, right? So I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, this is not going to end well. But basically, they're using this as a measurement of arousal because when you get like excitement, then you get vasodilation, and you can measure that, right?
Hmm.
And sure enough, like when you let people watch the game on television, when there's a line break or a try, then their arousal levels go up. They're engaged and excited. And when you have scrums and long delays because of a TMO decision or whatever, then the arousal levels go down. And so that
But
was among the things that was being used to motivate for this requirement to cut down on the dead time, try and make the game more exciting, more open, and so forth. Now, I have various thoughts on that piece of research, and there's so much bias and there's so much I think, misapplication that undermines its quality for how we make decisions in the game. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's this tension between we want open 1 hour, 30 minutes worth of coverage with so much action and so forth? Or do you also want the static moments in the game? I'm
no,
in the latter camp, but that is the argument that these folk are having.
you need more fallow, quieter moments in a game so that the peaks are enhanced. It's the same as a piece of music with an orchestra. That's why you get the quiet bits and you get the crescendos. And that's
That's
how sport should work. Because if it's just constantly 100% all the time, then that gets boring in and of itself. You can't stay aroused forever, as someone probably once said.
well, that's sort of exactly what some people are saying. And I think that is the biggest problem with that research is you can measure you can measure for a short period how things work, but it doesn't necessarily translate. And it reminds me actually of the very famous Pepsi versus Coke battles of the 1980s and 90s. And one of the famous things that happened there is that Pepsi killed Coke in taste testing. And what they would do is they'd go to public spaces like shopping malls or whatever, and they'd give people small sips of Pepsi and Coke blinded. And sure enough, all the potential consumers preferred Pepsi in the taste testing, like by a lot, like something like 4-1 people said, I liked option A, which turned out to be Pepsi. And Coke reacted to that by trying to change its formula. That's where New Coke came from. I don't know if you remember all that sort of stuff.
Mm.
But what the mistake that had been made there is that a small shot of Pepsi, 100 mils, outperformed a small shot of Coke. But when you had to buy a whole can or a whole bottle of Pepsi and drink it, it was too sweet. And so the
Oh.
analogy, the analogy was that one line break, one exciting moment is all good and well. Yes, you're right. But you can't have too much of it. And some people, maybe somewhat unfairly, said if you want that, then there's sevens. Go watch sevens.
Mm.
Or rugby league. If you
Can
want
I
a
ask,
simple game, simple one-dimensional game, watch rugby league.
in these conferences you have with World Rugby, do you get to put these points across, these analogies? Do they listen to your input? Because I mean, it's good input because it's thoughtful and it's coming from somebody who doesn't play rugby. You're a scientist who's involved with head injuries and concussions, but do they ever listen to your opinion on things like this?
No, but I also don't force it on them in that way because I'm there to support the player welfare issues. So I'll say things, for instance, like if we do successfully increase ball in play from currently in an 80-minute match, ball in play is 38 minutes. If we got it right or as desired and took that up to 44 minutes, that would be a 6 on 38. That would be a 12-13% increase in ball in play. Now, in those extra 6 minutes, there are going to be 16% more
Mm,
tackles,
right, okay.
more rucks, more exposure to risk factors. So currently we have 190 tackles in a game. If you elevate that to 230 tackles in a game, you will see more injuries. You will see more concussions. So there's a ball and play implication for player welfare. And I kind of try and represent that. But I'm not there to argue that. And I understand that the folks who are selling sponsorships and engaging in the commercial, they've got some different perspectives and insights and challenges than we've got. But I certainly talk about it quietly, but I'm not there to. And sometimes you have to know
Mm.
where you're not meant to comment.
Yeah, stay in your lane, Tucker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
But
it's
with
but
your
it's sorry,
oh,
go on.
no, go on.
I was just going to say it's an interesting debate because there is this tension about what the sport needs in order to grow. And so, for instance, there are stats that the rugby watching demographic does lean towards the older side. That's
Mm.
again something I'm not sure necessarily is a problem. Part of the reason for that is that rugby is expensive to go and watch when you go and watch live matches. And it might just be that the only people who can afford them are the older ones with disposable income. And maybe in 20 years' time, the current 20-year-old is going to be in that position and will go and watch rugby. So I would be asking, what did the rugby demographic look like in 2003? Was it
Mm.
also old? Because if it was, then that's just how it's always going to look. It's a misleading stat potentially if you take it as a photograph instead of tracking it over time, you know?
Yeah, because rugby still got it's still on terrestrial TV, at least in the UK, which I think is really important for a sport like rugby.
Yeah.
Because paywalling it could be disastrous because then it becomes even more just confined to that certain generation or that certain affluent generation. So to keep it open, but that's going down a different road there. Talking about staying in your lane, obviously you're there, as you said, for player welfare. And there's been a few things pop up about player welfare and concussions. One of which was spotted by Alan, I think it was, on he's the eagle-eyed member on supporter on Discourse. He was watching a Super Rugby match between the Reds and the Waratahs and noticed that the Waratahs hooker, Folai Falinga, he was hitting the head during a tackle. And at the next stoppage, he was assessed by the team doctor and cleared to continue. And the referee, Paul Williams, actually interjected, stopped the game. And he says he thinks that the player was knocked out. This is a referee saying this now after the assessment on the field. So the player goes off. He fails the HIA with a grade 1 concussion and misses the rest of the match and enters a 10-day rest period. So we discussed this on Discourse, and I was surprised that firstly that the mouth guard that they're all wearing didn't pick it up, obviously as a knock. But secondly, he actually passed a HIA on the field. So it sounded to me like in some ways, and sorry to say, that the system is failing in some ways.
Yeah, for sure, it's not perfect. I saw that clip only after Alan sent the message. I straight away got onto our video analyst, who's our dedicated play welfare guy. I said, "Please, can you clip this for us?" And he sent it, and it was interesting, and it does happen sometimes. So, just to explain, when a player has a head impact in the game with either the potential to cause or clearly causes a concussion, there are a few people whose job it is to look out for them. Obviously, the team doctors from both sides. Then you have an independent match doctor. But then also the three officials, so the on-field referee and the two assistant referees can look for that. And sometimes, depending on the tournament, you've also got a second match day doctor or a person who operates the Hawkeye cameras who's also tasked for looking for that, like at a World Cup, wouldn't have been relevant in Super Rugby. And the reason they've got all that is because there's like a redundancy there. So if one person misses it, someone else might see it. And then they can look at the video, agree, and say, actually, yes, this was a what we call a criteria one, which is where the player shows clear signs of concussion after the head impact. Loss of consciousness is one of those. There are 11 in total. And then the player's off, there's no test. So from the signs of what happened here is there was a head impact. The team doctor came on, hadn't seen that there was a loss of consciousness or a possible loss. They then assess the player on the field and they're looking for signs that indicate that they need to be removed. Now, in this case, that obviously should have happened, but the team doctor didn't see that. And so then was leaving the field and the player was staying on, and then the referee intervened. So you can argue it in two ways. One is, yes, the initial response to the head impact and the player's behavior failed. But I would argue that the fact that the referee can then step in and did is a sign that the redundancy has kicked in and worked.
Hmm.
Ideally, you'd never need that, but that's why it's there.
So why didn't the mouth guard trigger?
Yeah, the mouthguard not triggering is less of a surprise and less common because when going back to that, so just again, for those who are new to this discussion, the players now, not all, but 75, 80% of them are wearing a mouthguard that contains within it a small accelerometer. And that accelerometer measures the acceleration of the head, linear and rotational. And when and basically every time there's a tackle, there's a chance that the head rotates. It doesn't always happen, actually. About 50% of tackles don't cause any head rotation or movement at all, which is quite interesting. But sometimes if you get a blow to the head, you get a big head acceleration. And what we did 2 years ago now is we said that in order to be prudent, when a player has a particularly large one, we're going to also remove the player and take them off to have a check. Now, that was not meant to uh, betray or predict a concussion. It wasn't like, oh, you've had a really big head acceleration, you're concussed, come off the field. It was merely measuring a big head acceleration, and then we would let the concussion checks happen because we thought that it would be prudent in those cases. But then we had to say, well, when do we take a player off? How big does that head acceleration need to be? And we looked at all the head accelerations that happen in a match. And from a purely practical perspective, you can't pull the guy off. You can't take 10 players off a game to have them checked. You would completely overwhelm the medical staff and you would completely undermine your own player welfare campaign because the players would say, this is crazy. Like, I don't have anything to go off for. Why am I coming off? So the bar was set very high for that reason. And we targeted one mouthguard alert per match on average. Now, there are 1,000 head accelerations per match on average. So when you see an alert, you are literally looking at a 1 in 1,000 head acceleration. And that's why it doesn't trigger. Because that particular one, I can't give you the exact details for it. It was close to an alert. It was a 1 in 700, but it didn't reach the 1 in 1,000 threshold. And that's why it didn't go off.
Aren't you compromising player safety then with these 1 in 1,000, having to be a 1 in 1,000 events?
Well, because they're additive to what already happened. So you're still supposed to see
Right.
the head impact. And then for the ones that are missed by the human eye, we're hoping that some of them get added to the process by the mouth guard. If if it ever came to light or if it was ever positioned as don't worry because now the mouth guard has got them all covered, then it would be very bad.
Mm.
And one of the messages to doctors is don't rely on the mouth guard.
Yeah.
Mouth guard is there because sometimes you will miss a case and then the mouth guard might pick it up, but it won't. Even then, it won't always do it. But the main thing with a mouth guard is we just want the data from the game. It's not just the alerts that it's contributing. The alert was almost like a secondary benefit.
Mm.
We want the data from the game. I mean, that said, since it's been introduced in one competition last year, there were 91 concussions, and eight of them were identified in players who only came off because of an alert. So that's just under 10%. In another competition so far this year, this was a few weeks back, there'd been 36 concussions and nine of them, so that's 1/4, had been identified only as a result of a mouthguard alert. In other words, in 9 out of 36 players that were concussed, had there not been a mouthguard, the player would probably have stayed on the field.
And of course, the crowd don't want to see players going off. Viewers at home don't want to see players going off, and the players don't want to go off
Well, that's
when
the
these
big
things
part.
are triggered. Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
then that's why incidentally the calculus is always about calibrating the response because you asked, aren't you compromising it? You could make it more aggressive. We could set that alert at 1 in 200. And what would happen is that you'd have five players a match having to go for a head assessment. And that would be really disruptive. The doctors don't want that. The players will say no, and the coaches will say no. And I would predict fairly
mm,
confidently that within 3 weeks, no player wears the mouth guard.
yeah, it's a
And then
compromise.
and then you lose because now you get no data. And you should see the data we get. It's gonna one of the things that shape of the game that was discussed is how we make better use of the mouth guard data. And we've got some plans which will come out in the next month or so that I think are going to change the way load is managed in players and head impacts understood. So it's been really valuable, and we would lose all that value if we weren't sensible about where to put the threshold.
Because there's an example this week. There's BBC have released a documentary. Um, Ben Young's did a documentary on safety in sport about the safety in rugby. And the ex-Union player Anthony Watson, he was a British Lion, and he cheated a concussion test in the second Lions tour in 2017 in New Zealand. Um, he knew what apparently there were 5 words that had to be repeated during this concussion test, and for some reason the players were told them in advance, and he'd memorized them. So
Mhm.
he clearly knew he was concussed and taken off the field for an assessment. And he managed to get through the walk-in phase, just repeated these 5 words that he knew off by heart, parrot-like, and was allowed back on. And he says after the game, he knew he had a concussion, but he knew that if he was taken off with the concussion, he wasn't playing in that third test. And this is the pinnacle of a player's career, playing for the Lions. And he went on to play in the third test as well. So he obviously played when really he should have been in the protocols.
Mm.
So it just goes to show how much players will do to try and stay on the field. And I think he probably regrets it now. And he says that he doesn't think with the current system, the way it's set up, that he would ever have got away with it. He would have ever, which is good to hear. But it
Yeah.
does go to illustrate exactly what players will do.
Yeah, so that was 2017. And I just started, and pretty soon after that, not in response to that, but it was imminent anyway, we changed that test to make it 10 words instead of five. And also, just so you know, the way it used to work is there used to be, I think it was 6 lists of 5 words. So there was list A, B, C, D, E, and F. And list A was, for instance, do you remember when Donald Trump did a test to show that he was cognitively competent? And he was like, he came and said, I memorized the words, and the words were man, woman, camera, TV, person, or something like that. Remember that? Everyone had a good chuckle about it. I promise you, that's not the list that Anthony Watson memorized. And
No,
it's interesting, like there's actually so much to this because there's a whole bunch of neuropsychologists who have designed these tests. And you can't have a list like man, woman, camera, TV, person because all those things are so similar that it's too easy to memorize. So the way they make these lists is they come up with words that have no relationship with one another. So for instance, sunset, monkey, apple, and they all have to be the same number of syllables or same length. You can't have supercalifragilisticexpialidocious on the same list as the word hat.
yeah. Do the players know these in advance then?
But if you've played the sport long enough, then the problem is that you were able to, through
Or
experience,
just
learn what they were.
randomly generate them?
Well, this is the thing is like random generation can cause a problem because then you might randomly create a list that's related. So jumping ahead, the most recent change, which was a year or so back, was to take. So imagine you had 6 lists of 5 words each. The first change we made was to make it 3 lists of 10 words each. So now it already got more challenging. And the recent change was to make one list of 30 words and then randomly pick from the 30-word list. So now it's much more difficult. It would be very difficult to pass them, to memorize them. But I'll tell you what, like the data we've got, because remember the players come in at the start of a season and they do the baseline testing where they used to have to read these words. And about 20% of players would fail the word test without even having played or have had a concussion.
I would,
Yeah.
possibly.
So,
Yeah, terrible.
so the point I'm trying to make is that the neuropsychologists could make these tests considerably more difficult than they already are. And where they already are is that 1 in 5 non-concussed players is going to fail the memory test. If you make that twice as difficult to stop players from memorizing it, now suddenly about half of players will fail that test.
Where they
And now you've
shouldn't.
got the same problem because you've taken a player off, the player's not concussed, but because they fail the test, they have to stay off. You are slowly going to cause players and coaches and doctors to lose confidence in the screening process. And then you're worse off than you are now.
Mhm.
So it's quite a tricky balance to find when is a test hard enough that a concussed player fails it, but not so hard that a non-concussed player also fails it. Ideally, what you want, and this is diagnostics now, is 100 concussed players do the test, every single one fails it, and 100 non-concussed players do it, not a single one fails it. Then you'd have a sensitivity of 100
But
and a specificity of 100. Perfect test, but that doesn't exist.
well, no, because you've got the 20 who would have failed it anyway. So
Correct.
yeah.
And so the general principle is that the more sensitive you make it, in other words, the more likely a test is to catch who it's meant to, the less specific it is, which means it's also going to catch the people it's not meant to. So you move away from fly fishing to just trawling, and then it's a major problem. And then the final word on that is remember the screen that Watson would have undergone would have had that memory test. It would have had balance tests, symptom checks, another cognitive test, clinical signs, and then another memory test. So it's done that way because in series, the sum of the parts is greater than, sorry, the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
I don't suppose you've got any data on who passes these tests and who doesn't, like beforehand when they're not concussed. Do the thicky forwards fail it more than the backs? I'm joking. I don't know.
Never looked at it.
Yeah.
But you sort of joke, actually, there are challenges, right? One of the changes that we had to make was that players from Asia, so specifically Japan, because they played a lot of rugby, but also Chinese players, one of the tests was months in reverse. So you had to name the months in reverse. Go, do that.
December, November, October, September, August, July, June, May, April, March, February, January.
That's very quick, actually. You'd get full marks. So in Asia, that they don't have, apparently they number the months. So that test wasn't relevant and
Oh,
working there. So it was changed for those players. They now do serial threes back from 100. So you'd have to go 100, 97, 94, 91, 88, 85, and so on.
okay.
So, and then
Yeah.
similarly, the word list. I mean, you're a player from Georgia and you don't speak English, and now you've got to memorize a list of words. So you had to translate them, but in the translation,
Oh,
some of
that's
the
unfair. Surely it should be in your native language.
yeah, but then you got to get neuropsych experts to try and find words that have similar functionality and application. Because if you, again, you can't have
Well,
supercalifragilistic, and then hat.
okay. So the French players have to do it in English.
No, they do it in French. Everyone does it in
Oh,
their
oh right. I thought you said that you had. Oh right, and then you've got to do the
when they
translation. Right. Okay.
but where it does get tricky is like if you're playing in England and you're a Fijian player,
Mhm.
the doctor's English. And so you probably have to do it in that language. So there's so many interesting
Yeah.
challenges that people don't often think about. And you know what it does sort of bring us back to is you said earlier you feel like the product is good. And one of the things that came out of Shape of the Game is the sentiment that we do actually have a good product, and we should in fact be celebrating and promoting the product more. And one of the things that I'd say grinds my gears a little is rugby does apologize a lot for its complexity.
Well, it doesn't
Um,
need to.
and it actually should be celebrating and promoting that complexity. And so I think the onus is more on people to explain better and try and make people enjoy and appreciate that complexity rather than to sound downplay it and want to simplify the game all the time. And that's like, I mean, I'm in the player welfare side of it. Like what we've learned as well is we have to just explain it over and over and over and simplify why did the mouth guard not trigger? Why is the mouth guard not a perfect predictor of concussions? We
Mm.
can't explain this often enough. The storytelling side is where we all let ourselves down, myself included on the welfare side.
Yeah, I've been watching the Six Nations with a sort of more of a neutral view because I don't really have a horse in the race this time, being a Wales supporter. So you can watch games with neutrality, and actually, I've been trying to do it and look objectively at what's going on the pitch, with the ball in play, that sort of thing. And it's actually a good product. If you sit back and actually remove yourself from the emotional side of it, it is actually a good product to watch. At least this Six Nations has been.
Mm,
I just want to, I'm not going to bang on about concussion all day, I promise. Just a really quick one. Ben Donaldson plays for the Western Force, again in Super Rugby. His mouthguard lit up during a warm-up.
mm,
And so he missed the first couple of minutes of the game while he had a HIA. And this is really news following up on that Eli Katoa incident. Remember Katoa? He had suffered horrendous knock in a warm-up that nobody noticed because he didn't have his mouth guard in either. And then he suffered a brain injury due to playing on and getting another knock later in the game. So there is a positive side of the mouth guard being it's obvious there, which is great. It's that 1 in 1,000 knock, but it happened in warm-up, and it's.
Yeah, and I mean, in a warm-up, if a player was to have a head impact that presented clinically, as in I'm down, I've lost consciousness, tonic posturing, whatever, ataxia, they would then remove the player or potentially screen them, depending on how they were presenting anyway. But you're right, it's just again, it's redundancies. So like you trust, first of all, first line of defense is what you see. And your second line of defense is whether the mouth got alerted. And so you start acting on those. So after that incident happened, that was a rugby league international match. The guy was playing for Tonga, was he?
Yeah, I think it was Tonga.
I think it
Eli
was.
Katoa now, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, there was because we obviously have fairly close relationships with the other contact sports. That's why I'm in Rome, incidentally. We've got a collision sports meeting where all the so-called collision and contact sports spend a few days discussing shared challenges and solutions and so on. So anyway, we had a conversation with League and we decided that we would take that and just say, guys, just please remember, like the mouthguard is there not just at the first whistle till the final one. It actually supports your decision making even in the warm-ups.
Good that
So,
he's wearing it.
yeah, so the mouthguards are good. I saw you asked on Discourse whether I still watch the game through.
Yeah, through fingers. 'Cause just to explain, yeah, Ross did say on Discourse last year during the Six Nations that he tends to watch the games from behind the sofa through his fingers because in case the game is massively disrupted by mouth guards. Do you still do that?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't watch enough rugby to have to do that anymore. But it's definitely better than it was now because
Yeah.
I think more people have accepted it. It's become part of the conversation now, which I think is good and quite quickly, I'd like to think. Some better than others. Like in France, they've got a group of people working on the mouthguards in really innovative, clever ways. I'd say they're the leaders from the perspective of the player, coach, high performance world of trying to figure out how to make these mouthguards work for performance. Because so far, those mouthguards have been a medical device. And we have been trying and struggling, I guess, to make them accepted as a performance device also. And I think that's slowly happening now. They've been accepted as medical, and I think they're evolving into performance, in the same way that GPS is, as a load management tool. And one of my big projects is to try and think about how the mouthguard can become part of the load management strategy that teams use for players. You've got GPS, you've got contacts and game data, and then you've now got mouthguard data. And if we can integrate those, it'll be a big step forward. So the only things now with the mouthguard is sometimes they're not calibrated well enough when the player first gets them because
Mm.
they're so clever, these devices. They've got a little sensor in the mouthguard that actually knows when it's on the tooth. It's called a proximity sensor. And if the mouthguard's not on the tooth, like in a pocket, then it disables the accelerometer. So you shouldn't get false alerts. But the only requirement is you have to calibrate it first in order for it to work. And sometimes players don't do that. The first day they get it, they stick it in their shorts or their sock, and they never calibrate it. Then they play a match with it, and you get some
Because
dodgy readings. So education, tech advances, and we'll get there. But it's definitely better than it was. And yeah, as I say, I think we've got some cool data out of it now to make some real changes.
hmm Okay, so we'll move on from all your work and onto some play. Actually, we're going to go back to the Winter Olympics because we didn't get a chance to fit this in last week. When I was watching the women's 50K cross country skiing, the commentators were talking towards the end of the race about the length of the races and energy systems. I thought, whoa, whoa, this is interesting stuff. So I recorded it and we're going to play it back to you now. The commentators are Patrick Winterton and Mike Dixon, we believe. So there was a couple of things I wanted to bring up in this, and you can either correct or incorrect me.
Yeah, okay. So that next minute or so, you'll hear from these two gents who overall provided really good commentary, but we'll focus on this minute and 8 seconds. Here they come.
Thinking, of course, all these athletes go through this proverbial wall, where you're depleted, you're then bringing in a different energy source. If Heidi Vang been through that already, possibly, but she needs to keep focused because these five athletes are desperate to try and see her in the distance. Now, I know you feel that the 50K is too long for the women in terms of relative to what the men are doing, because they're going to be out there for 2 hours 20 minimum. The men were out there for 2 hours 6, and the women have stepped up from 30K. My argument would be that 30K is not an endurance test. You do not deplete your glycogen levels. You do not go anywhere near hyperglycemia, and therefore pacing isn't as important. Your nutrition during the race isn't as important. This 50K is a major, major test. And this is the Olympic Games after all. It is a major test. And interestingly, I think I was with Posey, that first ever 50K. And I did put that out, would it not be better to be 40Ks? Why 50? Because it's only going to benefit 2 or 3 athletes. But it was a very tight finish and it was a very exciting race.
So there's a few things to pick over there. And I'm not just picking on the commentators, this is because we're just sports scientists. Well, you are. So the first one of the first things they say is all these athletes go through this proverbial wall where you're depleted and switch to a different energy source. So is that the case? We've all heard about the wall in marathon running. Is that what he's referring to there as the wall, where your glycogen levels just suddenly run out and you then need to switch to a different energy source, which I presume would be fat?
Yes to the second question. That's the wall concept. But no to
Mm,
the first. The body doesn't switch. It's not like it's not like you're using. You see, I've used the analogy before actually that the body has these different fuel tanks and it can draw from the carbohydrate tank or the fat tank. But unlike in a car's fuel tank, so you don't just work off one and then suddenly it runs dry and then you say switch over to the next one. Or like a house that runs on electricity and then the power goes out or you forgot to pay the bill and then the generator has to kick in. That's not how it works. And if you look, we've discussed on this pod in the context of carbohydrates, some studies where they'll measure the contribution of fats and carbohydrates. And yes, there's a shift over time, but it's not a step change. And it's funny because when I was a kid, like I'm talking 13, 14 years old, I used to read Runner's World. A certain Mike Finch was the editor of the magazine, even back then. That's how long.
how long has he been doing that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Prince Pheidippides ran to Athens or whatever it was and said, "Victory is ours." Um, I'm like the uh, and anyway, the point was, I remember reading. It's so funny what you remember. I remember reading an article and they'd interviewed this woman who was one of the best marathon runners at the time. Her name was Uta Pippig, East German athlete. She'd won Berlin a couple times. And she was talking about her training, and she said the most difficult training she does are these long runs without any food in her before she goes. And then what happens is you just suddenly have to switch over to fat burning. And so that was for some reason, I remember this interview, but it doesn't happen that way. I remember then learning and going, huh, Uta was wrong also. So, so what,
So,
so what happens is that there's a shift over time. So maybe in the beginning, when your carbohydrate stores are full, your reliance on carbohydrate, it depends so much on intensity, of course. The harder you're exercising, the more you rely on carbohydrates. But maybe over time, fat increases its contribution to your total energy demand, and carbohydrates diminish over time. And remember, at some point, there's a crossover. And we said previously, one of the benefits that's been shown to ingesting more carbohydrates is that you can delay that crossover point almost to the point that it doesn't happen. You can finish 2, 3 hours of exercise and never have that crossover where more energy is from fats than carbs.
mm.
So vaguely this is true. You shift over time, but you don't switch in a bang, I'm out. I think what's happening though with the concept of the wall is that if you don't have any energy, then after about an hour 45 to 2 hours, your blood glucose levels start, well, they're always dropping. Your body's trying as hard as it can to defend them, but it's fighting, fighting, fighting. And at some point, that blood glucose level drops low enough that you get a cognitive problem, and then you notice it. So
Mm.
it might feel to you cognitively like now I've hit the wall, but actually it's like it's like getting old slowly, then all at once. That's what this feels like. You're running out of carbs slowly, and it feels like all at once, but it wasn't.
Well, that's the second part of the conversation. I'll just read it back. They said, I know you feel that the 50K is too long for the women. In terms relative to what the men are doing, the women will be out here for 2 hours 20 minimum, the men 2:06. The women stepped up from 30K. My argument is 30K is not an endurance test. You do not deplete your glycogen levels. You do not go near hyperglycemia. So 30K is taking them, I would say, they're doing about 28 minutes per 10K. So it's just under 90 minutes then,
Yeah.
84 to 90 minutes. Is it fair to say they're not depleting their glycogen levels if they're only running skiing at 30K?
So, okay, couple things again. Having watched that race, and remember, one of the first things we asked each other when we watched cross country for the first time is, do they drink and eat?
Yeah, and
And
they do.
you noticed that in fact at the top of some of the climbs, because they're moving at their slowest, there are coaches who give them something. They literally sip it for about 3 seconds and chuck it away. Now, someone who's an expert in flow rates can work out how much that is in 3 seconds. But the point is, they're probably getting 60 to 80 grams of carbs an hour in with that strategy.
Mm. That's very
fairly,
concentrated then. From
yeah,
what I
yeah,
could see, they weren't taking a huge amount on board, but
but regularly, no, because it was like
mm,
every 5 kilometers. So let's call it 150 mils every 5K. So that's every 12 minutes, 700 mils an hour at 10%, 70 grams. I don't
okay,
know.
we'll call it that.
Aggressively, maybe
Hmm.
conservatively 50 to 60. The point is that's not nothing.
Hmm.
Now, because of that, none of them, not even in 50K, are depleted.
Right, okay.
That's the first thing is depletion's a theoretical possibility that probably isn't realized because of the fact that they're taking carbs in on the ride. Again, if you're driving from Cardiff to Edinburgh, don't do so on one tank and think you're going to make it. You'll run dry. Like, but if you stop every 50 miles, you'll be fine. So so that's the first part. Now, the second part was, can you get depleted in 30Ks? I think so, yes. And one of the things about it is that a 30K race would be quite higher in intensity than a
Mm.
50K. And in actual fact, you could make a case that a 1.5 hour effort might be more vulnerable to carbohydrate. I don't want to use the word depletion because it makes it sound like a failure model, and we were so critical of that argument recently in the context of Noakes. But it's like if carbohydrates is one of the key regulated things, a 30K is probably just as challenging as a 50, but for slightly different reasons.
Yeah, it's like that old what's harder to run, a good marathon or a good like ultra endurance race, a good 50 miler or 100 miler.
Yeah,
And they're
just
two
different
different
context.
things, yeah.
Mm. So I would say that for both a 30K and a 50K, you'd have to get your nutrition right, but for slightly different reasons. You are, of course, more likely to, if there is going to be the depletion, that theoretical possibility realized, it's going to happen after 2 hours. So yes, the 50. But I don't think it makes it more likely that you'll do a good 30K on nothing.
So the argument that the 30K is not an endurance test doesn't really pass the sniff test at all. Of course,
No,
it's an
I think
endurance
it,
test.
yeah, I think it's not, and the
What?
50, we didn't really say this at the time, but the 50 is interesting because you could see that they were knackered by the finish line. But it's so interesting because, like, I'd love to see the composition of effort over 50K because it's so up and down that a lot of the time they're actually not really working. They're
Mm,
tucking and going downhill. And yes, there's a bit of postural work, particularly when they're going around corners and you've got to control with the outside leg and so forth. So remember when we spoke to Avon Sandbach, he was saying that they'll have to manage pace quite cleverly because when you're going uphill, you can actually go all the way to VO2 max power or intensities. And then when you go downhill, you recover. But if you go over VO2 max, you don't recover. If you go under, you underperform. So the titration of your efforts up versus down is quite an important one. But a 50K, those 2 hours and six, that 2 hour 20, it's probably not the same thing as a marathon. And that's why when people were
yeah.
saying like Klarbo's amazing performance winning the 3 minutes 20 second sprint. Okay, it's repeated sprint, which is very important. If it was a one-off, it might be different. Versus the 2 hour 650K, it's not quite the same as a 1500 meter guy winning a marathon because
Mm.
because it's more like cycling in terms of the stochastic intermittent high intensity, no intensity, high intensity, no. Whereas Eliud Kipchoge and Sebastian Sawe are running high intensity, moderate intensity the whole way.
Yeah, there's no recovery in a marathon. That's quite interesting. Never really thought about it that way. There's literally no recovery if you're a top marathon runner.
Yeah.
So
So
you're
cross country
really
skiing is kind of like halfway between running and cycling in terms of the management of your effort at specific moments in a 50K race.
interesting actually point that the women are going to be out there for 2 hours 20 minutes and the men 2:06.
Mm.
Should women's races be shortened slightly to sort of bring them into the same range? Because it's an unfair, well, not unfair because obviously they're just racing each other, but it's a slightly different challenge, and let's put it that way, to be out there for longer.
The cycling does that,
Hmm.
and I'm not sure that's the reason. But like a cyclocross race, Lucinda Brand was winning every cyclocross race in 48, 50 minutes. Van der Poel was winning them in 59, 61 minutes. So they've done it there. But that's shorter in terms of time even. So they've actually overdone it. You're talking about shorter in terms of distance to match for time.
Hmm.
Yeah, cyclocross has made it shorter in terms of time. So therefore distance is much shorter. Interestingly, actually, the Cape Epic, which is like they call it the Tour de France of mountain biking, that starts in the Western Cape in 2 weeks' time. And they will have a shorter elite women's race this year for the first time. And it caused an outcry because normally the elite women would ride exactly the same route as the elite men, and now they've made it shorter. No, I
But
don't know.
that's
I don't know.
multi-stage though, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so every day the woman, if the men are doing, I don't know, 86 Ks, the women are doing 74 or something like that. I don't know exactly what the.
I can see the cyclists why they'd be annoyed at that because
Oh.
in a multi day sort of thing. Obviously, it's
Mm.
slightly different. I mean, it's not as if women run a different length marathon either. So
Yeah. And
yeah,
that's the same, by the way. The 50K cross country skiing is the marathon in terms of time, right?
mm,
Men's winning time just outside 2, women's winning time 2:20.
yeah, that's fair enough then. That's okay.
So yeah, so I don't think
Yeah,
it's a major.
it,
I don't think those differences are large enough to really have metabolic fueling implications. And making it 30 wouldn't really changes their context slightly, but you still have to fuel it because the intensity just goes up.
mm,
I mean, the men are fueling a 20K skiathlon, so are the women, and that's like a 45-minute race. Because again, Marcel Guerini, remember when we spoke to him, those guys are taking a shot of carbs 30 minutes before the start, a shot of carbs at the start line, and once in the race.
mhm.
So they are aiming for 90 to 100 grams in a 1 hour race. Because again, this is the Tim Noakes problem. The reason for carb ingestion is not to stop carb depletion. It's to optimize performance in that moment with having high carbohydrates.
I mean, that's what we're seeing, aren't we? We're seeing
Yeah,
everything being fueled these days, even the shorter efforts. Because if you
exactly.
can, why not?
Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of short efforts, or what weren't short efforts, did you see much of the cycling this weekend? Did you see Paul Sexas?
I did, in fact, watch that later because I was watching Omloop when it happened. It's a pretty opening weekend. It's got these two concurrent events because they should actually be one after the next, not the same time. But anyway, superb performance. And yeah, we're all excited because we're all hopeful that we might see someone challenge for the front of these big races. Are we
Yeah.
being, hope dies last, remember? So I don't know, maybe we're being naive here.
Well, because Sexas, he left Jurgensen sort of standing, didn't he, on that climb? And everybody was like rapturous about his performance because I think he did the same time as Pogacar's done it in the European 6 months ago,
Mm.
16 minutes and 26 seconds, average speed of just over 25 kilometers an hour and 7.46 watts per kilo. So that's, I mean, top end world class. And as I say, everybody's been rapturous about it and hailing him as the new force in cycling. I just hope that they don't put too much pressure on his shoulders too soon.
Yeah, mentally and physically. Because I saw yesterday he wasn't planned to ride the Tour de France this year. The plan was Vuelta. But yesterday it was announced that he will almost certainly change that and race the Tour and then go to the Worlds. And the argument they're making is that Vuelta Worlds is too difficult. No, that's not why. You're sending him because he's like the best French talent we've seen in decades.
Mm.
And he is realistically at this point already in the top 4 or 5 climbers in the world. The challenge, of course, is 3 week race, durability, the maturation. But I also worry that because the pressure's on him, because he's going to carry that team, because not like they got 4 superstars that they can sort of spread out among big events. And the demand for their team to send him to every race is going to be enormous. So that's the
Any
concern.
any idea how long his contract is with Decathlon?
No, I don't
That's going to
actually.
be a factor of how quickly they need to bring him online because
Yeah.
the chances are, I mean, and I hope he doesn't end up on UAE because they don't need any more top riders. But it could be fascinating if he is a true challenger to Pogacar and now Del Tollo is going to be because apparently he's racing on Saturday, isn't he?
Yeah, Strade Bianche, which will be interesting actually, because that climb in the race that he won at the weekend matched Pogacar's time from Europe
Mm,
was a 6 and a bit kilometer climb that took them 16 minutes, right?
yeah, yeah,
So
just
he's
over 16.
he's clearly very good there. It wasn't his first win of the season, by the way. He's looked good all season, which is also concerning because it's only February, March. And historically, you didn't want to be in that kind of shape now because you want to improve. So if that's the case and he's not in that good and he's going to improve, then I'm very excited. But anyway, Strada's going to be different because that's going to be one with with attacks that last 3 or 4 minutes at a time and over and over. So does he have that in his physiology? I'm really interested to see that. Aside from the fact that the person making those attacks is not, no offense, it's not Jorgensen or Martinez or what's the other guy, Ericsson? No,
Mm.
Jan Christian. It's going to be Pogacar. So I'm pretty
Oh,
curious to see how he goes. But I would, please let them manage him till he's 24, not for 21.
yeah. But see, the problem is he's got Pogacar and Del Taro there on Saturday,
Mm.
so it's going to be difficult for him. Why isn't Van der Poel there?
Because they made Strada too hilly. It's got like 3,000 something meters of climbing. So if Van der Poel
Ah,
said, screw it, I'll go do other races instead. I think he's just written it off as a, yeah, I wouldn't say non-winnable race, but it's just, they just made it, it's too hard.
okay.
Mm.
Um, Staying on cycling, there was an article in the New York Times in the athletic version this week, all about doping in cycling. And it said, according to two different sources close to the UCI, speaking anonymously to protect the relationships, the sport's governing body has been pressing the ITA, International Testing Agency, which manages anti-doping programs for cycling, to find a high-profile case of cheating within the sport. So if this anonymous source is correct, why would the UCI be pushing the ITA to find? That's the last thing they want, is to find a big doper in the sport.
Funny, because at first, remember like after the London Olympics, they very proudly announced no positive tests
Mm,
because in the it's like I'm sure there's a doping equivalent to the stages of grief model. Stage one, stage one is pride that there's no issue.
right.
I don't know, we're making this up now. Stage two, stage two is like again, it's always pride. It's not, but you move from different reasons to be proud. Stage two is you're proud that you're catching people. The problem is, and this is what your critics start pointing out, is that you're catching the person who's ranked 6,000th in the world, who wins a Grand Fondo at the age of 42, or what was that guy recently, the American Masters athlete who got popped at like a Masters championship or something.
Mm.
Or it's a
It's
under 17 cyclist who wants a development contract. By the way, not unique to cycling. Like I think you can make the same case for rugby, for instance. They catch all the amateurs. And then the argument is made, well, when they become professional, testing gets better, so they stop
they
doping.
catch amateurs or they catch South Africans.
Yes, I wondered if we should put that in the spotlight, and I forgot to actually add it. We can talk about that next time, maybe. Um, the Anyway, then stage three is when the pride is replaced with a certain unease. It's like we know that something's going on, but we're never finding it. So it's like something starts to smell bad, but we can't find the source of it. And then I think stage four is we now need a big name. Because if we don't get a big name, we actually start to look inept. So what started as pride that we didn't have any positive doping cases becomes revealed later to be actually an inadequacy of the system.
But in which case, the UCA truly has to believe that at least one of the big fish is doping.
I hope
They
so,
can't
because
catch what
otherwise,
isn't there.
I hope they do, because otherwise it'd be delusional.
But then, but that would mean that one of the big fish is doping, and we don't know that.
Yeah, but I think there's so many people have been around for so long, and when you're in that world, you have a hint of it. Do you remember there was I should have thought of looking this up before so that I could be more specific about it. A paper came out published by two of the men, I think it was two guys, who were involved in the UCI's anti-doping program and the implementation of the biological passport. And what they were reporting on was the prevalence of suspicious but not clearly obvious doping samples. So, for example, you look at the off score, the hematocrits, the hemoglobins, the reticulocytes, all the elements that make up the biological passport. So, folks, this is where athletes will give blood samples many times over the course of a year, a career. And what the scientists are looking for is unusual fluctuations. So, did your red blood cell count jump too high? Did it drop too low? If it jumped too high, was that infusion or EPO use? If it dropped too low, was that withdrawal of blood? So you can kind of get an idea and you can categorize them with different, let's call it stringencies. So you can say, this sample is textbook perfectly normal, no suspicion of doping. Or you can have slightly unusual, but it doesn't quite reach the threshold. A little bit like our IMG conversation, it's high, but
But not.
it's not an alert. And then you get the ones that are like so high that you say, open a case, we're going to go for conviction. And what this paper showed was that the prevalence of these unusual samples was not 50%, but it wasn't 5%. It was like 20 or 30, I think, percent. And then you also have those surveys. Remember, we spoke, the Spanish, French, British athletes were surveyed anonymously using those techniques. Have you ever doped? Yes. So anti-doping authorities know that the prevalence of doping is higher than the positive test ratios numbers.
Yeah.
And that's why they must know that something's going on. Plus, they may have tip-offs. There might be guys that are getting tip-offs saying, by the way, I worked as a masseuse at a hotel this week in the south of Spain, and it was this team, and I saw the following stuff. They know, but they need a sample to nail it down.
But the problem is the top riders, they're tested all the time. If they're leading a Grand Tour, if they're winning races, they're tested non-stop. There's no way they're going to be able to get away with it. I suppose Armstrong did, but we're in a different era now.
Yeah, Armstrong was just before the biological passport became really good. But then, even then, I remember David Walsh telling me that he'd seen Armstrong's biological passports at the time that he made the comeback. They would have been what, 27, 208?
Hmm.
And he said the passport, he was obviously doping because the passport was perfect. So
Yeah,
it was
too
too
good.
unnaturally perfect. Um, but anyway, like I think I would imagine, I wonder do you remember when we spoke to Brett Cloutier of the AIU and he said their big appeal to anti-doping is to give us new tools because they don't think they've got the necessary armory to go after the weapons that are being used by the dopers or the tools to detect it. That remains my main concern, I suppose, is a
And
level of doping that's sophisticated enough that it can't yet be detected.
mm,
So
tell you what can be detected is if you meet some ex-doctor who was well dodgy on the border of a country and happened to ride past your old man meeting him, and your old man's getting, who was that? Soleil, wasn't it?
just,
That was a
just
bizarre
a
one.
coincidence.
Yeah, just a complete coincidence. Anyway,
My bad
but
luck. My bad luck, he
my
says.
bad, like, oh, hi, Dad. Um,
By the way,
anyway,
just before we leave that one, if this was a Hollywood spy story and you had to find a scapegoat, it's interesting to think like who would be the perfect scapegoat for cycling to get. They
it's
wanted
not one of the big ones. It's not
no,
Pogacar. It's not
no,
Vingegaard. It can't be Sexias now. Can you imagine the outcry in France? Dear Lord. Um, it
so
would have to be a
purely
Pedersen's, somebody like a.
purely hypothetically, you want a big enough name that's got big
Hmm,
name recognition, but not so big that it could like undermine and damage sponsorships. So the big teams and the big sponsors, the people who give you money, leave theirs alone and find someone who people's names will recognize, but no great loss. That's purely hypothetically now. Think about what
I'm
that might
perhaps
be.
not quite as cynical as you. I honestly don't. I can't just see how the top riders are doing it. I, I, I hope they're not. Put it that way. I was thinking actually about this morning. We're talking about sex athletes being hyped up as the greatest thing ever in France because France is desperate for a tour winner, aren't they? They're
Yeah.
desperate for a top cyclist. What other sports or countries are the country so desperate for a winner again? And I was
England,
thinking about the only I could think of is England in football.
I was just going to
So
say,
desperate to win a major tournament.
it's coming
Uh,
home this year, Gareth.
oh, don't, please don't, God no. Well,
Um,
there'll be nobody left in the tournament at this rate. Um, so yeah, that's something to think about. I'll just
I mean, Brazilian football's getting there.
Oh, they won it recently, haven't they? Won it 20, I don't know actually.
202, right?
God, is it that long ago? They beat Italy, wasn't it? I think was that the last Brazilian World Cup victory?
Yeah, because six was Italy beating France, 10 was Spain, 14 was in Brazil. That's when they got hammered by Germany 7-1 or something, right?
Hmm, remember that one.
So, yeah, and they certainly declined.
Yeah,
I mean, what others?
2002. But I was trying to think of what other sports, what other countries are so desperate. It'll that's one for discourse. I'll leave
South
the discourse
Africa.
members to come up with some answers for that. I'm sure David will have some ideas. But the whole of or the whole of British sport every time they enter any competition.
They're just as desperate as that to win a match against Italy this week in the Six Nations. Um, South Africa cricket, any trophy will do. And speaking of the semi-finals of that
You
tournament that's happening that we haven't watched the ball of is today and tomorrow.
you won the Test Championship last year.
That's true, but that's not a tournament.
You
It's a
can't get picky
no,
if you're South Africa in
I'm
cricket.
definitely being picky. You want to win where there's a knockout and a final, not a one-off.
Are they in the semi-finals? It's England, India. I know that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it has to
New
be.
Zealand, South Africa, is it?
That's today, yeah. So
Okay. I've
yeah,
not been following, just hardly been following that.
yeah, neither have I.
Uh,
Anyways, yes. Next.
I was going to say, speaking of Britain, British tennis player Tara Moore, do you remember her? She's actually bringing legal action now against the women's tour for negligence. She's suspended currently for 4 years for doping in a very convoluted case. Convoluted. She was first suspended in June 2022 after testing positive for boldenone and nandrolone at a tournament in Bogota in Colombia. In December 2023, she was cleared by an independent tribunal that found that contaminated meat was the likely source of the positive tests. Then the ITA, who are currently looking for a cyclist, they appealed to the Court of Arbitration and overturned that ruling. So in July 2025, CAS reimposed Moore's original 4-year ban, removing the 19 months already served. It's so complicated, these processes of being appealed. And then why counter appeal? Why did the ITA counter appeal? Is doping shooting itself in the foot with the complexity of its cases?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's actually the main reason that you've got the movement spearheaded by Travis Tygart to change the list so that these small concentrate or low concentration of, let's call them less than grade A doping substances should be changed. Because
Hmm.
maybe their, I mean, not maybe, their argument is that case like this should never even seen the first case, never mind the appeal and then the counter appeal.
Why did the ITA counter appeal? Any idea?
I haven't,
It just
I honestly
it's a bit
haven't
odd.
read these cases. I haven't read them in enough detail. And when you shared this link, it reminded me that I need to do that because it came up last year. Um,
But we do see this, don't we? We do see players getting cleared and then somebody else say, no, that's not on. And it's like,
Let me put it to you
it's,
this way though, like if a player's caught with a banned substance in the urine and is cleared, and the agency responsible for anti-doping doesn't appeal that, then fans say what?
hmm, yeah,
So
it def-
we kind of, you know what I mean? Like that,
yeah,
like think about the Sinner reaction. He could have been cleared on the first case. Oh, that's not on you.
yeah, it's
Off him.
favoritism.
So so they kind of almost are obliged to, unless they really do believe that it's a case of inadvertent doping that's not worth any suspension. And it would be interesting to read because you've got to go there and you've got to look. Remember, an athlete can have a failed test, an adverse finding, and still be found to have no fault. Like Iga
Hmm,
Swiatek had a positive test for a banned substance. She was found pretty much to have no fault, but still served a very short ban because she didn't have zero fault.
yeah,
And so there's like it's not black and white, as in you're a doper, you're not a doper. You can have a positive sample, but not be declared to have any fault, but still serve a short ban because it might be that you were just a little bit negligent about not checking that medicine, checking that supplement, and whatever the argument or the context is. So it would be interesting to know whether the ITA in this particular, it's not the same one, is it? This is the International Tennis Integrity Agency, not the
oh,
International.
it's different, is it?
Maybe the tennis people need to get into cycling though, who knows? The
It's too many acronyms.
yes, the anyway, what was I saying? I was saying that they may have said we are not happy with this being a complete exoneration. We still think that this athlete should serve a minimum of 3 months, 6 months, whatever. But in the end, she gets 4 years. So the specifics of the case must be quite interesting. Need to look into those.
Yeah, because I mean, she's part of it. You just mentioned the two tennis players, and she's alleging that the authorities that they show preferential treatment to the more high-profile players, such as Yannick Sinner and Swiatek, because they only had 3 months and one month. But I
Yeah.
don't think, I don't think that's really she can
Yeah.
base any sort of case on that. But the other interesting part of this story is that she's claiming that the WTA were negligent because they failed to warn players about the risk of contamination from eating meat, specifically before the tournament in the Colombian capital, it says. She's seeking 20 million in compensation for what the claim describes as reputational and financial ruin, arguing that the WTA failed in its duty of care to protect athletes. So when I read this, I just thought, well, hang on a minute. Can you really be expecting the WTA to babysit you through the entire process of being a professional tennis player? You should know this.
Yeah, I mean, Contador blamed contaminated beef, I think somewhat spuriously. But subsequently, I remember contaminated meat has been, I reckon, other than a contaminated supplement, it's the go-to contaminant, right?
Yeah,
Um, and as a result, I can think back more than a decade. I reckon by 2008, 9, anti-doping agencies were warning athletes about the risk of eating meats in certain places in the world. I recall the USA, this would have been Beijing 2008. US anti-doping warning its athletes about going to Beijing in the Olympic Games and eating the meat. Subsequently, I remember seeing a similar warning issued for South American products. So, okay, and that's not the WTA. But the point is, in the wider circulation were all these warnings about not eating certain meats and being cautious about what you did. Now, can an athlete then go to Colombia and claim to have had no information, no education, no warning? And at what point does the athlete need to take some responsibility for themselves? I don't know. It just seems like a reach to me.
very much a reach, especially if you're going to go for 20 million. I suppose if you're going to go for it big. But
So to
uh,
win that 20 million, she first has to show that the conviction of doping was false. She's got to show that it was genuinely a contaminant and that she did take all the necessary precautions,
mm,
which from the reading of it, she's failed to do twice because she's done it once but failed twice. And then you've got to show that the support provided to you before the fact wasn't sufficient.
a
It seems
stretch.
like a reach to me. Maybe you can get the 4-year ban overturned, like as in, yes, we think you're, because remember the standard of proof in these cases is like more likely than not.
Mm,
Um, and I'm quite sympathetic, just like I was with Schwantek. We spoke about another one. What was the other one we spoke about where it was a contaminant? But I mean, in other instances, like Houlihan's case, it's not easy to be sympathetic. So the specifics matter a great deal. They don't go on precedent. So the way one case was handled doesn't really affect the next one in the sports anti-doping world, in the arbitration world. So relying on other cases isn't going to help her. She has to win the case on its own merits, her own case's merits, and I don't know. You'd have to see what those arguments look like. But 2 out of 3 haven't ruled for her. So
hmm Look, okay, we'll stick with doping. We're doing a bumper episode to say today because we might not have you next week. I don't know where in the world you're going to be, but we might not have you next week. So let's get it all done now. Um, so KSNZ on Discourse asked a quite interesting question. He says, the women's athletic world records, those that have been standing since the 1980s, he says, and strongly smell of doping, especially in the shot put and the discus. There's more than that, I know. Shouldn't they be cancelled in the same way that weightlifting records were reset at one point and the sport effectively started with a clean sheet? And he mentions a number of records here, such as shot put, discus, long jump. These were all set in the 80s. You've got the 800 meters, as we know, that was set in 1983, and then the 400, 100, 200. They were all set in the 80s. In fact, there's a lot of women's records set back in the 80s. Now I think about it this way. So he's saying, should they be wiped out and starting from scratch? Is there any merit to that?
yeah, the problem is the problem is that we can say with 90+% certainty, but how certain do you have to be to take them away?
100.
And what do we need to get to 100?
Exactly. It's that
It's not.
old, do you execute somebody? You know, you can execute 100 people, isn't it? But if you get one wrong, you shouldn't do it at all, sort of thing.
But maybe, yeah, and maybe you don't need it to be 100. Maybe you can just do it. The problem there is Sidney McLaughlin, the Ravens record also has to go.
Why?
Because you can't preferentially scratch them based on anything less than 100%.
Well, so just reset every record.
I think you'd have to.
Can't you just reset the dodgy ones?
What makes
We're going into circular conversation here. I know.
But that's kind of the challenge is because this conversation has been discussed or ha has been had before. In 2009 or something, I think it was discussed that they should be resetting all the women's world records. And one of the big opponents of that was Paula Radcliffe because she held one at that time.
Well, yeah, you would
Now,
be, wouldn't you? Yeah.
now it's interesting. If that same conversation was had in 2019, when Bridget Koskei was the world record holder, would Paula Radcliffe have objected? Probably not.
Hmm.
Now, should they have, did they stall on it only because of Paula Radcliffe? I doubt it. I'm not saying for a second here that she managed to block them doing it. But the principle is there. Like if you say that you're going to take away the dodgy ones, you have to have a threshold of dodginess. And
Which
what
is arbitrary.
yeah, which is going to be, and I mean, to be clear, I don't for a second think that any of those world records that you listed there are clean. Um, because we know what was happening at the time, and we know there was no testing at the time. There is one, by the actually, just thinking about it, there's one way you could maybe do this. Because you could go back in the history of anti-doping and you can ask, when was in competition testing introduced? When was out of competition testing introduced? When was the biological passport introduced? So you could almost have watershed moments, and you could say, you know what, actually, there was no out of competition testing before March
Hmm.
1987. Therefore, anything prior to March 1987, we're going to take away because it fell in a period where we know we couldn't trust the performance. In other words, it's like you can't sanction a record now if you don't have a wind reading and an anti-doping test and a course measurement. You could maybe they could do it like that.
Well, that's what KSNZ he actually suggests that he could split world records into pre-2009, which is when the biological passport came out, and then post-2009,
Yeah, it was a
which is a
little bit
possibility.
before that.
Why is it only women's? Why are we only discussing women's records? Why not men's records?
Well, that's the point I made on the discourse as well, is that you
Can you
could
imagine getting rid of Bolt's records?
That's exactly the point. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the super shoes, the middle distance and long distance world records would look dodgy too.
Well, they do. The 1500 therefore looks
That's
dodgy,
the
doesn't
only
it?
survivor, right? That's the only surviving record. The 15 and the mile are the only surviving records from that era. But in that era, all of them fell. The help me out. The 3,000 went to Coman. The 5,000 went to everyone. They were taking turns with that one. The 10,000 fell to Hisu, then Turgat, then Gebri
Hmm.
Selassie, and so on. So, like, they were all going at that stage. And it's really interesting. I posted a link and I'll put it in the show notes. York Olaf Schumacher, who was one of the biological passport developing scientists, he did a really interesting analysis where he looked at women's discus and men's 5,000 meter running. And he showed how those performances responded immediately to the introduction of anti-doping out of competition in the case of the discus and the biological passport in the case of the 5,000. The performances were just going up and up and up, faster and faster, further and further. They introduced those tests, and within one season, they dropped back down again. Not just the best, but the average of the top 20. So there are there are ways I reckon that you could argue for it, but in general, it's probably you need to be more confident than just suspicious. Or you
Do
got to take them all away.
do women benefit from doping more than men?
In those testosterone doping products, definitely.
So that's why at least
Yeah.
three of the
Yeah.
events are shot put, discus, and well, perhaps not long jump so much, but strength events, obviously.
And the power events on the track. You look at 100, 200, 400,
Mm.
800.
All of these are below 1,000 meters, yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And then of course in the 1990s, and see those ones are gone, but that was the Chinese. The Chinese came along and they smashed the 15, the 3, the 5, the 10, all in one all in one week, basically. And they've been thankfully eradicated as a consequence of it's a mixture of different things. But it is interesting, and I've often said if there was such a thing as a sports science archaeologist, the world records are in effect a fossil record of doping behaviors. because they you can track what the doping practices would have been through the decades based on when the world records were broken and how long they stood. And women definitely benefited disproportionately. And it's a shame because if you think about a career of an athlete who breaks 3 or 4 world records and the sponsorship bonuses, the appearance fees they would have earned off the back of that, not to mention the direct money made off breaking the world record, how much more opportunity there'd have been to make money for women that doesn't exist because those records are out of reach.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, one of them hopefully might be going this year, eh? Keely Hodgkinson. There was an interview actually with her in the Times last week, which had a few intriguing bits in it. Firstly, she reckons she's put on 6 kilograms of muscle since the Paris Games, going from 54 to 60 kilos. And that seems like an awful lot of weight gain for an 800-meter runner to
Yeah, I mean
me.
that's 10% of total weight just in muscle mass.
Yeah, but
But now, are we sure that that's not something that's because I didn't see the originals. I'm sorry, I've been so immersed in rugby stuff for the last week. Could it be? Because remember in Paris there was some talk. This was the Paris Olympics or the Tokyo Worlds.
she just says, I'm actually up to 60 kilograms. In Paris, I was sitting at 54. So I presume she means the Olympic Games.
Okay, okay, yeah. So it's over 2 years.
Yeah, well, 18 months.
Yeah. Like I was when I saw that, I wondered whether maybe that was like she's reporting the lowest extreme then relative to the highest number now. And that the truth is more likely somewhere in the middle, you know? Like could it be my at the lightest that I ever was with significant dehydration after a hard session or race or
Hmm.
whatever in the heat. I was 54. But normally, by the way, I was 57. And now at my heaviest, I was 60, but actually when I race, I'll be 58. In which case, it's not really a change, but it's kind of like being skewed by recollection and selective comparison. I don't know.
Well, she's been doing it to prevent injuries, really, because she said she had a series of hamstring problems caused by a lower back. And so they've been trying to manage this by increasing her strength with a combination of gym and bike work.
Yeah. And over,
So,
over 18 months, I think, because if that was Tokyo to now, then oh, hang on a moment, that's really rapid. But 18 months, I can see it being plausible.
mm,
Maybe it is something that they focused on. It,
yeah,
yeah. I have seen a few people saying, like, this is not a conversation that should be had because we're talking about ideal weight and women's bodies and so forth and so on. But I mean, she's opened the conversation up. And I think in a positive way, no? So it's not a
yeah.
problem. It's positive. This is.
She's it's a positive thing because she's
Yeah.
putting on muscle and weight and not,
Yeah.
So, I mean,
So,
later in the interview, she talks about going for the 800 world record. And her problem with pacing is that she wants somebody to lead her through to at least 600 meters. But of course, all her rivals aren't going to be doing that for her. So she needs to find somebody to get her to 600 meters on world record pace. And she actually said, well, the ideal person to be doing it would be a man who can get me there. But obviously, that's going to invalidate any records. So that might be her biggest problem because I think she's probably going to do it this year, the form she's in.
yeah, if she got a good day. I don't understand. Like surely Georgia, what's her face, Hunter Bell could get to 600 meters at world record tempo. Because what do they need for that? They need a 55-second first lap and a 58-second second lap. So you'd need 55 and then maybe another 28 and a half. Like you got to
Hmm.
imagine that one of her training partners can make 600 or at least get her two-thirds of the way down the back straight.
Hmm.
But yeah, if you
Well,
stick to Manning, then it's just Faith Kipyegon in Paris all over again.
yeah. She says, ideally, I'd want somebody there until the 600-meter mark, but that's not easy when runners of that caliber would be the people I generally race and why they want to help me set a world record. But you're right, her training partners or Georgia Hunter Bell, if they're just going flat out, they can do 600 meters, surely. I
Like
mean,
what's the
Hunter Bell's
600
not far
meter?
behind her.
What's the 600 meter world record?
I don't know. Is there one? That's a random.
Yeah, didn't Kipyegon? No, that was the 1,000. Sure, Keely Hodgkinson went for it. Anyway, but there is one. It's maybe done more often indoors.
Well, the
But
record, I was going to say the record is she ran 56.82 and 56.46 are the splits.
58.46, surely second lap.
Uh, no, 56.82, 56.46.
Who's that? Kratos?
Yeah.
Goodness. That's not even an optimal performance in an 800.
What would be what's wrong with that?
Well, you want a positive split. So normally the first lap will be at 2 seconds or so faster than the second. So she even split the 153.
Nothing wrong with that. It's
No,
a world record.
she could go fast. She could have gone faster than that.
Yeah, she was off her tits on drugs at the time. Oh, sorry. um, anyway,
I saw, speaking of credits, Vileva, I saw a funny thing on Instagram. Someone had posted. So obviously, I don't know whether it's a bot or someone who, I don't know, but they say, you know, that like, why is no one talking about this athlete? 21.9, 200, 47.8, 400, and a 153.3, 800. Those were credits Vileva's three best performances from the 200 up to the 8. Why is no one celebrating her? Well, because she was basically glowing in the dark. That's why.
yeah.
But anyway,
So
I think Hodgkinson could get that, and I don't think having a pace setter all the way through 600 is necessary. She just needs no wind. Because the other thing they've got is the lights now. So you just got to get yourself there and then just hang on to the lights for the last 200.
there's something psychological about following a person, though, surely.
Yeah, so get that person down the back straight up to 550 meters or something, and you'll be
Hmm.
golden. But
There
I,
we go.
I do think Georgia Hunter-Bell, if you can run a 156, you can get to 600 in whatever I worked that out to be, 55 plus 29. I don't think that's that difficult to ask her to do.
Hmm. Yeah, well, we'll see this year. Proof will be in the
Mm.
pudding. So last up then, and finally, there was chaos in Atlanta, as Citius Mag put it, with the US Half Marathon Championships ending in farce, really, because with under 2 miles to go, Jess McLean was leading and looked well on her way to a national title, it says, until the lead bike and car led her the wrong way, along with the two runners in second and third places. You sent me this on Sunday, and we were looking into it at the time, but we didn't have the footage. We have the footage now of the car, the bike, turning left off the course, and the three runners following it. And it's quite obvious now that this is the fault of the people who are running the race. I think it's the Atlanta Track Club, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
And they've said as much. I saw a statement by the chairman and they apologized for it. And so it does feel like the responsibility has been identified.
but the problem is this is a qualifier for the World Championships, isn't it? In Denmark on the 20th of September this year. So the US track and field, there was an appeal, and they've said that basically the jury of appeals finds no recourse within the rule book to alter the results order of finish. It seems that the system again, and system broken again here, because surely common sense should prevail. And all they've got to do is just say, look, at the point where the race went horribly wrong, we'll take the result from there.
I don't understand why it's taken them as long as it has. I have seen statements that are suggesting that they're considering it, and I think they probably are going to end up, excuse me, in the right place. And the right
Well,
place is that at the very least, the three athletes selected for Worlds should be the three that were sent wrong, because that wasn't a mistake made at like the seventh kilometer of a 21K race. It was right near the end, and the difference between third and fourth was so big that you'd be delusional to argue that that mistake isn't what cost the result, right? So it really seems quite logical.
yeah. And there's been people saying, oh, well, it's the athlete's fault. They should know the course, etc. But
No.
this is like 2 miles out in a half marathon. When you're going full gas, you just follow whatever's in front of you. You're not thinking about, which way
And
should I go here? And it
unless,
was badly marked.
yeah, yeah. So I was going to say, there's only two ways that I would lean towards that position. One is the athletes have deliberately been told at the start line or with the pre-race briefing the night or day before, folks, the car's going to turn off at some point so that we've got a clean finish line shot without the car in the way. Please don't follow the car. Then if you follow the car, it's because you weren't paying. Then it's different. And the second thing is, if the course is well marked, like with a giant banner saying 19 Ks and keep going straight, and you close the parallel roads off, or the perpendicular roads, right?
Mhm.
Then it's different. But when you see the video, like, I mean, if anything, they'd set cones up. I don't know for what purpose, but the cones made it look like you had to go left.
Yeah, they curved off to the left. And
Yeah,
when a
like,
car goes to the left with the big clock on, which you would be following, to be honest,
yes.
and the motorbike
Yeah.
with the camera on, which way are you going to go? I
So
feel
I
so
don't,
sorry for him. It cost her 20 grand and potentially a place.
Yeah. So
So
I think there's two things that they could do. First of all, USATF, who make the team selections for Worlds, they could very easily step in and say, we understand that it's not in the rules, but in this specific incident, it was such an egregious mistake that very clearly cost athletes. There is no claim from fourth to go, no legitimate claim from fourth to go. So therefore, we're going to apply the most logical thing. We're not changing the rules for this. We're just going to apply it to this unique situation. Done. End of story. No one's going to object. I even saw a post made by one of the agents of an athlete who ended up on the podium as a result, effectively apologizing and saying that the athlete wouldn't object to being not named in the world team. So they've got the way is clear to do it. The financial recompense is different, and I feel like they should try and find some way to compensate the athlete. Maybe they just got to pay twice the prize money, and if their insurance covers them for something like that. But the way to alleviate this in the future, I was thinking about, is you just got to tell the athletes that don't, by all means, put the car there. But what you need is a bicycle with a number plate or something on it saying 1F, first female, 2F, second female. And the bicycle is going to go to the finish. And the bicycle's got its little Wahoo or its Garmin, and it's programmed its maps in from Strava, and it doesn't get lost. It's really simple. I don't
but
understand why they mess it up.
you might have hit on it slightly earlier on in that they don't want it in the finishing shots of the photos or the footage. That's
But
why
the bike is
that's why they
perfect.
pull them off. So yeah, perhaps a bike
The
is
bike's
perfect.
perfect because by the time the bike pulls off with 300 meters to go, it can be on the far right-hand side of the road. The runner is aiming for the finish chute and the banner and the finish
Yeah,
tape.
you can't go wrong there. Yeah.
So the USATF just need to have a policy saying that any race with prize money needs to have a designated lead bike whose job it is clearly stated to ride the course 50 meters in front of the athletes. And then you never have this again. It's just
Yeah, I
what a
mean, they've
mess.
said the USATF have said that the American team's not going to be officially selected until May, and the governing body will continue to review what took place in Atlanta. So hopefully they come to the
Yeah.
right conclusion. But obviously, it's a stressful, awful time for the athletes involved.
Yeah,
There we are.
imagine the panic that sets in. I'm amazed they finished. I think I'd have stopped.
I've been lost in more races than I can count. But then again, I need a map and compass in some of them, to be fair. It's a horrible feeling to know you've got to do more. But
Yeah, how far did they go off? Half a mile?
yeah, something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there we are.
That's that.
When will we see you next, Mr. Tucker, Professor
Yeah, so,
Tucker?
so next week I fly back actually. I'm in Rome now for the next few days. Hopefully watch Italy win at the weekend.
You no, you just jinxed him, you fool.
And I say hopefully. Then I am in London for just 2 more days and then back to South Africa Tuesday night. So we won't, because the thing about this is that Garrett's time to record is Wednesday morning, and I won't be able to do a Wednesday morning next week. So therefore, next week will be, let's call it a fallow week, like in Six Nations tradition. And then we haven't had a feature podcast for a while, but we have been discussing a little plan of action. So we'll be back next with a feature podcast week after next.
Hmm.
Unless, of course, the ITA catches a high-profile doper, in which case we'll do an emergency.
Emergency.
Well, who knows? Maybe something else happens. Just one other thing that is happening next week is World Rugby every week does a series of online symposia on player welfare, and they are open to the public and the media. So I will put the links for those and the program. There's going to be a talk on the mouth guards. There's a talk on headgear, which might be of interest to some listeners in rugby. There's a talk on player load and so forth. Not, by the way, it's not just me nattering on, it's all sorts of people. So I'll share the program with our followers, and I'll put a link in the show notes today as well for other listeners. If you do want to become a supporter or member of the Science of Sport community, there's a link in the show notes. Click on it. I got an email actually from someone on Patreon this week with some feedback from a show, and I said, you know what? Thanks for the feedback, but this is exactly the conversation that's happening over on Discourse. So there's a lot more to everything we say, and our listeners deliver the value. So you want to hear more? Click the link, make a monthly donation, price of a gel or a coffee, and you can be part of that conversation. For now, though, this conversation is over. So thanks very much, Gareth. Thanks all for listening, and we will speak to you all in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
You have been listening to the Science of Sport podcast